It began the way so many moments in Washington begin, with a question that sounded polite on the surface and dangerous underneath. The kind of question that forces a room to hold its breath even before anyone answers it. "Madam Speaker, excuse me. Former Speaker Pelosi, may I ask you about December 15th, 2020? The words hung in the air, measured, calm, almost courteous. Yet everyone in the room understood that this was not small talk and not nostalgia. December 15th was not a random date, not a ceremonial anniversary, not a footnote in a history book, but a hinge point, a moment where timelines, markets, and power appeared to brush up against one another in ways that made people uncomfortable to even contemplate. That morning, Nancy Pelosi had attended a classified briefing on Operation Warp Speed and vaccine distribution. The kind of briefing that happens behind secured doors, where phones stay outside and information moves faster than headlines. That afternoon, according to publicly available trading disclosures, her husband, Paul Pelosi, purchased millions of dollars in call options tied to Pfizer stock, a move that, at least on paper, would prove to be remarkably well-timed. The next day, the FDA announced emergency authorization for Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, and the market responded the way markets tend to respond to good news delivered at the right moment. Within 48 hours, the trade showed gains that would make even seasoned investors pause and reread the numbers. Coincidence, some would say, because markets are chaotic and investors take risks every day. Suspicious timing, others might whisper, because the human brain is wired to see patterns even when none exist. And somewhere in between those two reactions sits the uncomfortable question no one ever seems eager to answer out loud. How often can timing be perfect before it stops feeling accidental? The voice that raised the issue in the hypothetical scenario, many commentators have since debated, was not angry or theatrical, but clinical, steady, the tone of someone accustomed to dealing in documents rather than slogans. It was the kind of voice prosecutors use when they believe the calendar itself might be the most persuasive witness in the room. The silence that followed was not dramatic in a cinematic sense, but heavy in a bureaucratic one. The kind of silence that suggests everyone present understands the stakes, even if no one wants to articulate them. Nancy Pelosi, now in her mid-80s, sat at the table with the posture of someone who had spent decades at the center of American power, flanked by attorneys whose suits alone hinted at how seriously the moment was being taken. She was no longer speaker, no longer wielding the gavel that once shaped legislative outcomes, yet the aura remained, the practiced calm, the carefully maintained image of someone who had weathered storms that would have ended other careers. Still, observers noted something subtle but different, a stiffness that had less to do with age and more to do with the nature of the scrutiny. This was not a shouting match, not a cable news ambush, not a performance staged for viral clips. It was, at least in theory, a conversation about numbers, dates, and sequences of events that could not easily be waved away with applause lines. The setting itself added to the tension. The room was officially closed, shielded from public view, yet crowded with staff, investigators, and cameras recording for the Congressional record. A reminder that even private moments in Washington have a way of becoming public eventually. Outside, reporters waited with the patience of people who know that silence inside a hearing room often precedes noise everywhere else. This was supposed to be routine, some said, an examination of stock trading ethics, a topic Congress has circled for years without ever quite landing on meaningful reform. After all, stock trading by members of Congress and their families is not illegal under current law, provided disclosures are filed. That fact alone has long served as both shield and sword in debates about ethics, a technical truth that leaves many Americans uneasy even as it remains legally accurate. Nancy Pelosi herself had testified before Congress countless times over a 40-year career. She had seen investigations come and go, accusations flare and fade, critics rise and vanish. And through it all, she had maintained an almost gravitational pull on her party's center of power. She may well have expected this moment to follow the same script. Questions would be asked, answers would be deflected, lawyers would object, and by the end of the news cycle, attention would drift elsewhere. What made this scenario different, at least in the way commentators have reconstructed it, was the emphasis not on intent or rhetoric, but on arithmetic. Dates did not argue, and spreadsheets did not raise their voices. At issue was not whether any single trade violated a statute, but whether a pattern existed that raised questions no soundbite could fully resolve. If one trade aligned with a classified briefing, that might be chance. If two did, coincidence still had room to breathe. But what if dozens of trades appeared to cluster around moments when non-public information changed hands in Washington? At what point does coincidence begin to feel statistically awkward? Supporters would argue, fairly, that Paul Pelosi is a private citizen with the right to invest, and that sophisticated investors often anticipate regulatory outcomes using public signals. They would note that financial news, congressional calendars, and political momentum are not secrets, and that plenty of traders attempt to read Washington tea leaves every day. Critics, equally fair in their skepticism, would ask why certain trades seem to outperform so consistently, and why those successes appeared unevenly distributed across time. Why, they might ask, did periods of extraordinary gains coincide so neatly with moments of extraordinary access? The discussion inevitably drifted toward wealth, a subject Americans are both fascinated by and wary of. Nancy Pelosi entered Congress in the late 1980s already wealthy by most standards, a fact often overlooked in more populist critiques. Yet the growth of that wealth over the decades has raised eyebrows even among those inclined to give her the benefit of the doubt. Can congressional salaries, prudent investments, and business income plausibly account for the figures disclosed today? Or does the question itself reveal more about public distrust than about any individual's conduct? Charts circulated showing net worth growth alongside career milestones, and while correlation is not causation, correlation is often enough to ignite suspicion. The moment Pelosi became Speaker, the charts showed. The curve steepened, and whether that means anything remains the subject of endless debate. What complicates the conversation further is the role of communication. Spouses talk. That is neither unusual nor illegal, and the law recognizes privacy within marriage for good reason. Yet timing matters, and when phone records align too neatly with market moves, even innocent explanations can begin to feel strained. Did conversations occur immediately after briefings because couples check in with one another, or because something urgent needed to be shared? Is urgency itself evidence, or merely projection? No one in this hypothetical account declares guilt, because declaring guilt would require a standard of proof far beyond commentary. Instead, the narrative lives in the gray space Americans know all too well, where legality and legitimacy drift apart and refuse to reconcile. The most uncomfortable question, perhaps, is not about one politician or one family, but about a system that permits these questions to linger unresolved. If nothing illegal occurred, why does the public remain so unconvinced? And if everything was above board, why does the math feel so unsatisfying? Pelosi, in this reconstruction, is portrayed not as a villain, but as a symbol, a stand-in for a broader unease about power and profit-sharing a zip code. She spent decades defending institutions, yet those same institutions now struggle to explain her fortune in ways that feel intuitive to ordinary voters. The tension, then, is not whether a crime occurred, but whether trust eroded beyond repair. Once trust is gone, every coincidence feels calculated, every denial sounds rehearsed, and every silence becomes louder than testimony. As the imagined hearing pressed on, the questions multiplied rather than narrowed. How much foresight is too much foresight? At what point does being well-informed start to look like being unfairly advantaged? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if this scenario makes people uncomfortable, what does that say about the many similar scenarios that never draw scrutiny at all? The room, according to those who dramatize the moment, never erupted, never exploded into chaos. It simply stayed quiet, a quiet thick enough to force everyone listening to confront a truth they might prefer to avoid. That in Washington, innocence and credibility are not always the same thing, and legality does not always equal legitimacy. And once that realization settles in, no amount of procedural correctness can fully restore what doubt has already taken away. Not motives, not slogans, not who clapped for whom in what election year, but the dead simple order of events. Briefing, trade, announcement, profit, repeat. And once you put it that way, the whole thing stops sounding like politics and starts sounding like a math problem someone forgot to show their work on. Because in the real world, coincidence is not a magic word that ends a discussion. It's the word you use when you don't yet have a better explanation, and you hope everyone will politely move on. The question that had started the room's discomfort, December 15th, 2020, wasn't even the most inflammatory part. It was just the cleanest example, the one with the neatest edges, the one that fit on a single index card without needing footnotes. And that's why it was dangerous. Not because it proved anything on its own, but because it invited the next question in line, the question that always shows up right after the first one. How many clean examples exist before the clean examples become a pattern? At this point in the narrative, you could almost hear the invisible tug-of-war in the room between lawyers and human instincts. Lawyers prefer categories: legal, illegal, privileged, unprivileged, admissible, inadmissible. Human beings prefer stories: who knew what, when they knew it, and why the timing looks like it's wearing a suit. Nancy Pelosi's attorneys, in the way these scenes are often described, leaned into the safest ground available: separation. They'd emphasize that Paul Pelosi makes his own investment decisions, that spouses can have separate spheres, and that disclosure forms exist precisely to prevent secret dealings. And that's all true, in a narrow sense. But narrow truths don't always survive wide scrutiny, because the public doesn't sit there parsing legal doctrine like a law professor with a grading rubric. The public listens the way people listen when they're deciding whether they trust you, not whether you technically complied. It's why the conversation keeps circling back to timing, like a moth circling a porch light. If the timing is harmless, why does it keep showing up? If it keeps showing up, why does it keep looking so profitable? This is where the tone, still careful, still non-accusatory, starts leaning into something sharper. Skepticism that doesn't claim guilt, but refuses to accept fairy tales. Because he reads the Wall Street Journal is not an explanation for a trade that lands like a bullseye right before a major government announcement. People who actually trade for a living don't talk like that. They talk about data, volatility, cataly. They do not usually talk like somebody threw a dart at a ticker symbol and happened to hit the exact week a federal decision became public. The most awkward part, from a storytelling standpoint, is that the line between lawful and suspicious is not always visible to the naked eye. The trade could have been luck. It could have been intuition. It could have been a bet placed for reasons no one in the room understood. But could have been is exactly the problem, because once you're stuck in could have been, you're also stuck in could have not been. And Americans have become allergic to uncertainty when it involves powerful people making money at convenient times. So the hearing, or the imagined hearing, evolves the way these things always evolve. It stops being about one date and turns into a wider timeline. A slideshow of moments where government power and market movement appear to have nodded at each other in passing. And that's when the story starts to feel less like a courtroom drama and more like a long-form documentary where the narrator keeps pausing and asking, "Now, why would that happen?" Not, "This is what happened," but, "How would you explain this if you were being honest with yourself?" The questions, as you're trying to write them for voiceover, have to walk a tightrope. They need to be pointed without being prosecutorial, skeptical without being defamatory, sharp without being reckless. So you keep it framed as perspective, as observation, as the kind of doubt that grows naturally when the same type of coincidence keeps showing up with the same type of payoff. And you lean into what Americans recognize immediately: the feeling that the system has rules, but not everyone experiences those rules the same way. Because here's the thing that makes people bristle, even if no law was broken. If you're a nurse or a mechanic or a warehouse worker and you accidentally file something late, penalties show up fast. If you're a powerful political figure and disclosures come in late, it can feel, fair or not, like the consequences are a rounding error. That perception is the gasoline. The trades are the match. And then you widen the lens, because the story isn't just Nancy Pelosi, and it never has been. Nancy Pelosi is the name people know, the symbol people can picture, the face that makes a complicated issue feel personal. But the issue itself is older than her and bigger than her. It's the nagging suspicion that government service has become a place where the smartest people don't just write laws, they learn the future before everyone else does. Not because they're evil, not because they're cartoon villains rubbing their hands together, but because access itself is an advantage. And advantages, when paired with markets, become money. Now, to be clear, this is where responsible commentary draws a line. You do not say, "They did it." You do not say, "This is criminal." You do not narrate assumptions as facts. You say, "If this looks bad to you, you're not crazy. If this makes you uneasy, you're not alone." If you're asking how regular people are supposed to compete in a market where some players might see the chessboard before the pieces are even set, that question is legitimate. Then you add the subtle humor, the kind that lands because it's true enough to sting without being cruel. Like this: most Americans can't even get a customer service rep on the phone in under 2 hours. But somehow Washington's timing can move with the elegance of a Swiss watch when it involves a profitable trade. Or this: ordinary investors spend months learning the difference between a call option and a phone call. Yet in these stories, the phone call seems to be the option that matters most. That's not an accusation. It's a wink at the structure of the suspicion. And suspicion, once it's structured, starts demanding structure in return. People begin to ask for a consistent explanation, not a vague reassurance. Because "we followed the rules" is not the same as "nothing about this is troubling," and "it's legal" is not the same as "it's defensible." That's why the narrative naturally drifts into what feels like the simplest moral test. If an average citizen did something that looked like this, would they be treated the same way? Would they be offered the benefit of the doubt? Or would they be told that coincidence stops being convincing after the third time? And that, right there, is your escalation point. Not by making claims, but by tightening the questions so the listener can't wriggle out with lazy answers. What did Nancy Pelosi know about Operation Warp Speed that the market did not? What did Paul Pelosi think was about to happen that made that trade feel worth millions? If it was public information, why did it line up so cleanly with a government moment most investors couldn't possibly attend? And if it wasn't public information, what does that mean about the kind of market we're all pretending is fair? This is the part where defenders will argue, again, sometimes sincerely, that smart investors anticipate FDA decisions all the time, that vaccines were expected, that approvals were being discussed publicly. And you let that argument breathe, because you're not writing propaganda. You acknowledge it. You even grant it for a second. Sure, maybe a savvy investor could place a bet on a likely approval. But then you ask the next question. Why that day then? Why that size? Why that structure? And why does the story keep coming back to moments where official Washington knowledge and official Washington money seem to show up in the same frame? If you're doing this as a voiceover piece, you keep tightening the tempo. Shorter punches mixed with longer lines, like a person talking faster when they're connecting dots they didn't want to connect. Because here's what the audience feels, even when they can't articulate it. They don't want to be lied to. And they especially don't want to be told that the thing they can see with their own eyes is nothing. So the imagined hearing continues, and the tension doesn't come from shouting. It comes from the slow realization that the easiest defenses don't actually answer the core questions. They just change the subject. Which is why the story keeps narrowing back to the same central point. Trust. Nancy Pelosi can insist she never gave anyone any special information. Paul Pelosi can insist he traded based on his own judgment. Those statements might be true. They might also be incomplete. And in politics, incomplete can be more damaging than wrong, because it sounds like you're hiding behind technicalities. The room, in the way we're telling it, becomes a mirror of the country. Half the people see a smear campaign, half the people see a pattern, and almost everyone, regardless of party, sees something that makes them ask, quietly, why Congress keeps refusing to end this debate with a simple rule. Because if there's nothing to hide, banning the practice should be easy. And if banning the practice is hard, people will assume it's hard for a reason. That's the drumbeat you keep hitting as you build toward the next act. Not, she's guilty, but why does this keep happening? Not, they're criminals, but why does the system keep producing stories that look like this? And then you set up the next escalation, the point where it stops being about one trade and becomes about the broader machinery. Disclosure delays, complex financial instruments most voters don't understand, and the way Washington always seems to have an explanation that sounds technically correct and emotionally empty. Because in the end, what destroys public confidence isn't always proof of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's the feeling that the people in charge are fluent in loopholes, while everyone else is fluent in consequences. And once that feeling takes hold, every timeline becomes a suspect. Every coincidence becomes a question, and every answer that doesn't actually answer becomes evidence of its own kind. So the story pushes forward not with a verdict, but with a dare. If you want the public to believe this is normal, explain it in a way that would make sense to a person who doesn't have a law degree, a stockbroker, and a PR team. Explain it like you would to someone who has to work overtime just to afford groceries, someone who can't call a broker at Morgan Stanley like ordering a pizza. Explain it like you would if you actually cared whether people trust you. And that's when the quiet in the room changes again, because the questions are no longer just about Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi. They're about Congress itself, and whether America is willing to keep pretending that access and profit can sit together without corrupting the meaning of public service. The next step is where the narrative gets sharper, because it introduces the second layer, not only the trades, but the choreography around them. Who was in what meeting? what was on the calendar, and why timing keeps looking like a practiced skill rather than a random accident. And once that door opens, it's hard to close it with a smile and a talking point, because the country has heard too many talking points and too few satisfying explanations. By the time the story reaches its final stretch, it no longer feels like a hearing, real or imagined, and it no longer feels like an argument about one family's portfolio. It feels like a referendum on whether Americans still believe power can sit next to money without quietly leaning into it. Not colliding, not exploding, just leaning, the way gravity works when nothing pushes back. At this stage, the questions stop circling Nancy Pelosi as a person and start orbiting the space around her. The system that allowed this conversation to exist without ever producing a clean, satisfying answer. Because the truth most people instinctively recognize is this: if everything is truly innocent, clarity should be easy. Innocence, when it's real, tends to simplify things rather than complicate them. Yet what keeps emerging instead are explanations that are technically plausible and emotionally hollow. Answers that survive courtrooms but fail kitchen tables. And that gap matters. It matters more than indictments, more than hypotheticals, more than partisan talking points. The final act of this narrative is not about declaring guilt or innocence, because commentary isn't a courtroom, and skepticism is not a verdict. It's about what happens when the public starts doing the math on its own and realizes the numbers don't tell a comforting story, even if they don't tell a criminal one either. Because Americans are surprisingly tolerant of wealth. What they are not tolerant of is wealth that appears to arrive with a security badge and a congressional calendar attached. This is where defenders often say the quiet part out loud without meaning to. They argue that lawmakers are surrounded by information, that they cannot simply unlearn what they know, that their families live in the same world as everyone else and should not be punished for proximity to power. And that argument lands, briefly. Of course, lawmakers know more than average citizens. Of course, that knowledge shapes their worldview. But then comes the follow-up no one wants to linger on. If access itself is the advantage, why allow access to become a financial instrument? This is the moment where even sympathetic listeners start shifting in their seats. Because the defense begins to sound less like justification and more like resignation, as if the unfairness is simply the cost of doing business in Washington. And that's not a message voters tend to accept quietly. They may tolerate hypocrisy for a while, but they do not like being told it's inevitable. So the narrative resolves not with a bang, but with a narrowing. All roads lead to the same unresolved tension: legality versus legitimacy. Nancy Pelosi can say, truthfully, that she followed the law as written. Critics can say, truthfully, that the law itself looks inadequate when held up to real-world outcomes. Both statements can coexist, and that coexistence is precisely what fuels the unease. The most revealing part of the story is not any single trade, not any single date, not any single coincidence. It's the absence of a clean moral boundary. If the rules were clear, the debate would be short. If the behavior were clearly wrong, the outrage would be unanimous. If the behavior were clearly acceptable, the suspicion would fade. Instead, what lingers is ambiguity with sharp edges, and ambiguity, when paired with power, tends to rot trust from the inside. This is why the discussion inevitably broadens to Congress as an institution. Why haven't lawmakers banned this practice outright? Why do reform bills stall every time momentum builds? You don't need a conspiracy theory to answer that question. You just need to recognize incentives. People rarely rush to give up advantages they insist they aren't abusing. And the louder the insistence, the more people wonder why the advantage is worth defending so fiercely. By the end of the imagined exchange, the room no longer feels adversarial. It feels weary, weary of disclaimers, weary of procedural defenses, weary of explanations that technically answer the question while carefully avoiding the point. Because the point is simple, even if the law is not. If public service grants early access to decisions that move markets, then public service should come with restrictions strong enough to prevent even the appearance of exploitation. Not because everyone will exploit it, but because no one should have to wonder. And this is where the story lands its quietest, sharpest line. Trust does not survive on disclosure forms filed weeks late, and fines small enough to disappear into rounding errors. Trust survives on rules that make temptation irrelevant. The Pelosi story, as it's debated and retold, becomes a case study not in alleged wrongdoing, but in perceived entitlement. The belief that proximity to power normalizes outcomes that would look outrageous anywhere else. That perception, fair or not, sticks. And once it sticks, reputations become fragile in ways no press conference can fix. You can sense this in how people talk about the issue, not with rage, but with cynicism, not with shock, but with a tired shrug that says, "Of course, that's how it works." That shrug is the real damage, not to one politician, but to the idea that the system is even trying to be fair. And this is why the ending does not offer closure. There is no gavel slam, no definitive conclusion, no cinematic justice. There is only an open question hanging in the air long after the cameras stop recording. If everything is above board, why does it feel like it requires so much explaining? If nothing improper occurred, why does the story refuse to settle into the background noise of politics? And if lawmakers truly believe this behavior is harmless, why do they resist changing the rules with such consistency? The final irony is that banning congressional stock trading would likely protect lawmakers as much as it would protect public trust. No more timelines to scrutinize. No more coincidences to debate. No more suspicion soaking into every disclosure form. Yet that solution remains perpetually just out of reach, which tells its own story, even if no one ever says it out loud. So the narrative ends not by condemning Nancy Pelosi, and not by absolving her either. It ends by holding up a mirror and asking whether Americans are willing to accept a system where access and profit are allowed to coexist indefinitely, provided the paperwork is filed. Some will say yes. Some will say no. Most will simply say they're tired of pretending not to notice. And that, more than any allegation, more than any imagined hearing, is what gives this story its weight. Not the certainty of guilt, but the persistence of doubt. Because doubt, once earned, doesn't disappear just because someone tells you it's unfounded. It disappears only when the rules change enough that the question no longer needs to be asked. Until then, the dates will keep lining up. The charts will keep circulating. And every time a powerful figure insists, "There's nothing to see here," a growing number of Americans will quietly reply, "Then why does it keep looking like this?" That question doesn't accuse. It doesn't convict. It simply refuses to go away. And in a country built on the idea that public office is a public trust, refusing to go away might be the most political act of all.